Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the next session. I am going to let Dix get the show on the road, but it's going to be a very interesting take from what I hear about what the US government's currently doing. Please welcome Dix.
Good morning. First, thanks for AusCERT for having me here, and the folks from M5 for inviting me down to speak at the conference. First time in Australia, so it's been a very interesting experience and rewarding experience for me so far. My topic today really is about what the U.S. government's doing in cyber and our strategy and how we've gotten there a little bit, and then some of the things, the services and capabilities that the Department of Homeland Security is doing to implement that cyber strategy, and in some cases some of the things that are available to folks in Australia that could support your efforts in your cybersecurity. First, probably the couple of themes that I'm going to talk about, and I'll try to wrap up. I have a couple of use cases to kind of show you in a couple of slides the so what of the presentation today. But the threat, much like everyone else has been talking about here, drives what we do in strategy and policy, and then of course in programs that are implemented. And my experience with the threat, principally the nation-state threat, kind of like a dance partner, right? And the closer you hold your dance partner, the more you understand what the other partner is doing and which way they're moving. And that's critically important to security of your networks. Whether you know it or not, every day you're dancing with the threat, and the threat doesn't do anything to you that you don't allow them to do by either the network configurations you set up, the software you use, or your business practices and how you approach it. But they'll exploit it. So doing that, understanding the threat and holding that threat very close is important. And then the next is certification, accreditation, and hygiene. All good, all necessary, but not necessarily sufficient to protect you. So without further ado, I'll just get on into it. Threat, I think everyone here, we've covered the threat pretty well this week in a lot of the talks that have been given. My purpose in showing the threat here is, as you build your defense, you need to really kind of have your strategy to approach each of the three different types of threats, the main threats that are out there. And the internet pollution with just AV, as you move up the stack in cybercrime and the nation states, and we'll talk about them a little more here in a second, your strategies and the things you need to do need to be a little more sophisticated and probably a little more prevalent. The challenge also has been, over the last 5 to 10 years, the nature of the threat, principally in the cyber criminal and the nation state, has changed. 5 years ago, it was not uncommon for nation state actors to only really primarily be operating against other governments, right? And they have a collection plan, they go out, they're looking for information, depending upon which nation it is, and they're pulling that information back, analyzing it, and doing other things. But as we've talked, other folks this week have talked, the gentleman from the FS-ISAC, even some of the things that the Hack5 folks talked about yesterday with the rubber ducky and the USB drops, been used in other nation-state activities, right, to get into people's networks, and just a means to get in. But the threat complexion has changed and has gone against other organizations other than what you would typically associate with nation-state actors, government to government. Think of the things that the financial institutions have hit when they were having the DDoSes attributed to the Iranians, right? The Iranians weren't really going after the financial institutions just to disrupt them, but they were messaging the U.S. government and other elements of the nation states about what they could do. Sony Pictures, I have a friend and a colleague, John Simone, who was the CISO there. He since moved to Dell. But they got a screening from the North Koreans, right, on their movie that they were going to put out destructive malware, kind of took it to the next level. That wasn't just about the movie, but it was also about the government-to-government communications that were occurring. So we have to be cognizant of that. And as folks here at this conference, you're not all government, but you can expect that nation-state actors will be very interested in what you're doing, and the connections you have throughout your interconnected network allow them to come into your networks and take advantage of your infrastructure, either for what you have, and if you're a critical infrastructure provider, or as a launch pad for other things. Attack trends, the real purpose in this slide for me isn't what's on the slide, but it's the fact that attack trends and methods are merely the means to get into the networks. So as a person that did, I was military background. My first job in the Army, I did what we now call cybersecurity, but it was ADP system security a long, long time ago. My last job in the Army, before I retired, I was a network defense and network attack officer on the Joint Staff at the U.S. military Joint Headquarters in the Pentagon, integrating attack capabilities into our war plans and one-off operations. So anything that we would do, we'd always want to do the cheapest, easiest, and what would leave the least fingerprint on who was involved in it, right? And I bring that up only because we have hundreds, thousands of nation-state actors that are doing the same thing to us every day, right? If I can get you with a piece of malware that is available on the internet, widely used, but it still works, that's probably what I'm going to do. If you are much better, a little more refined, and your defenses are better, and I have to go to some other measures, we'll keep stepping it up until we get done what needs to get done. One of the other briefers also, if you remember, had a slide of Cottonmouth. It was a hardware implant that's used when other means aren't successful. So the threat really has gone full range. So it's not just what you can do electronically, it's also your supply chain that you have to be concerned about, so the social engineering, and pretty much your business relationships with your supply chain. All venues, they're full spectrum, and they'll approach you from all different angles depending upon the level of sophistication that you have in your defenses. Threat analysis. The purpose for this slide really is, in listening to everyone this week in this conference confirms, we're really pretty good at the technical factors of our business. We can look at things, we can collect it, we look at the packet data, we can tear it apart, we can figure out what was going on, know how the threat actor got in, know what he was trying to do, know what each bit was doing and how it was rotated. And we built, this is a Northrop Grumman security fan, kind of our approach to cyber, but security for all the aspects. The one part that I think strategically that we as a community, the cybersecurity community, have not done a great job of is understanding the human factors. And the human factors, I'm getting back down to, there is a cyber actor in whatever country, whether it's, let's say, China, Russia, or some other nation state, that's sitting down, has a collection plan, has a boss, has a mission, and he's out to do things. And we need to, I think, do a little more thinking on what is the actor doing, why are they there, why are they in my networks, and what are they after? As opposed to just the technical. I found this piece of malware, it's really kind of cool. They've done this new thing, and I hadn't seen it before. Stop for a second and think about, well, why did they do that? Right? They took some extra time and effort for a reason. They didn't just get up that morning and go, oh, I think I'm going to go into X network and look around and see what they're doing. They have a collection plan. They have a priority list, and they're out executing that. And just like when I was on the other side of this, I had a boss, and when we weren't successful, you get, okay, I need you to be more successful. What are you going to do next, right? So you keep pressing until you get what you need and satisfy your bosses. And the nation security actors do the same thing. And I think our analysts need to be a little more strategic in how we approach things and look up from just the technical aspects of the cybersecurity arena and look a little more in the strategy and the strategic side of that and what the human factors are and what the folks are doing. Okay, the threat really for the U.S. government has driven what we do as a strategy and policy and how we're approaching cyber. We've gone around a number of different ways. Started out 10, 15 years ago, we were trying to keep the threat out. Let's stop them at the edge and they won't get in, we'll be fine. That didn't work very well. Then we went with segmentation, looking at everything throughout the system and trying to boot them out. And where we've arrived at really is kind of a, when I was in the Army, we had to prepare for chemical attacks, so you have to, your protective suits, and you got them in, and nobody liked to do it, made everything a lot harder. But we're kind of in the, what I call the chemical environment for that. We know it's dirty, and we're going to have to operate in a dirty environment. We still have to do our mission or accomplish the business objectives of our organization, regardless of what the threat or the threat actors are doing inside of our networks. So we've kind of come down to a risk management framework and an information sharing approach. Risk management, to look at those things that are critical, and then information sharing to get as much information out as fast as possible so that people can improve their hygiene. The current strategy is there are 6 major pillars to the U.S. approach on the strategy and what they're doing on the big blue mats there, and I won't go over the slide in detail. The new administration has come in, hasn't necessarily formulated their cyber strategy. I know they're working on it. They have released a new executive order essentially making the heads of the federal departments and agencies responsible for their cybersecurity and telling them that they have to come back in 90 days to do some detailed plans on what they're having to do. But this is the current strategy that we're working with, principally and all driven by the experience with the threat and how we're trying to protect the U.S. networks. Federal lanes, every major department has their own cyber. There are 6 major centers that do cyber in the United States. The FBI has one, the intelligence community, DHS has one, the NSA's Threat Analysis Center, the Department of Defense's U.S. Cyber Command, then there's a intelligence community incident response center. Essentially, everybody has a lane in the cybersecurity role in the U.S. federal government. And we have a standards and technology organization, NIST, that provides that, comes up with strategies and the standards that the federal government's supposed to meet. And then there are also voluntary standards that are developed for U.S. critical infrastructure. I'm going to talk a little bit about DHS because that's one most aligned with what folks at the conference will be, I think, would be interested in. No briefing about a government organization would be complete without an org chart. But for folks that aren't familiar, the Department of Homeland Security was given the mission after it was stood up after 9/11 to do cyber for the federal civil government. The Department of Defense has U.S. Cyber Command that takes care of all the military and the military organizations. FBI does law enforcement and investigations. And DHS was given really the charter to do a similar thing like Cyber Command for the military, except for all, I think there's like 86 federal civil departments and agencies in the federal government. That's one mission. The second mission was to assist and overview and oversee critical infrastructure key resources in the U.S. And provide information and assistance to them. And then the last mission that we have is really international partnerships and providing information with that and collaborating across that space. There are 4 major components in the National Communications, National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center. There is the United States CERT, which I think is most aligned with the AusCERT, and they work very closely with them. We also have an Industrial Control CERT, and then we have a National Coordination Center for Communications. Essentially what they do is anytime the federal government in a crisis needs communications or bandwidth, the NCC will go out and acquire that. Then the last component is the watch floor, the 24/7. The NCIC, as it's called, is really a production center for communications and cybersecurity related information. It doesn't really have the authority to tell anybody in the federal government to do anything, unlike the U.S. Cyber Command that can make directives to the military services and departments to turn this port off or do this, stop doing that. DHS does not have that authority. It is an alert, a warning, and information sharing organization. So it's kind of a production house for cyber-related product. These principally on the left-hand side are the major mission areas that the DHS NCIC provides to do that. And really it's the traditional blocking and tackling of cybersecurity, if you think about it. There are a couple things that are a little different at the bottom. On the information sharing venue, the last administration, U.S. administration, embraced kind of information sharing as the way to, can't get ahead of the threat, but try to get to parity with them. And the approach on information sharing is if you set up a sharing of information and the community comes together, and if one person has an intrusion, they work it, identify it, they share it broadly. They put it into a system that can then be shared very broadly with everyone. Everyone can come in and download those indicators and then protect themselves from future attacks using that particular exploit. So that's kind of the information sharing approach that the administration has taken. And some of the programs I'm going to talk to you about are executing that strategy. Analytic method. Essentially, at the national level, which is where the Department of Homeland Security and the NCIC are operating, we're pulling information from a lot of different places that some organizations wouldn't have access to. And much like everything else, you have an echelonment. And at this layer, what we're trying to do is provide information from open sources, threat feeds that we're getting, correlating, as well as the other departments and agencies in the federal government that are reporting in things that are happening, or tip-offs that we're getting from some of the capabilities that DHS operates for the federal government. Our second-party sharing arrangements and agreements that go back and forth, and then other international stakeholders, and I have a slide on that. But essentially what we're trying to do is bring that information together, collate that down, publish it, so that folks, particularly in the federal departments and agencies in our critical infrastructure, and the stakeholders that are involved in some of the information sharing projects that we run, don't have to worry about necessarily going out and building that same network. We're providing it in these channels. So that's what we're trying to do, so that everyone doesn't have to go about doing the same thing. Threat services. This is one of the things that DHS has stood up and looking at to assist the critical infrastructure in the states. Essentially looking at 750 million raw records a day, correlating that down. There's a lot of duplication in there, so you have to boil it down. And developing customized reporting and information that flows into the information sharing projects that DHS has, and there's like 5 of them. That have different purposes and different stakeholder groups that it's targeted out. But this is one of the things that this is essentially what the internet is reporting on itself. These are open source, also commercial paid providers that DHS leverages that we use for them, pulling threat data in every day, boiling it down, and then assigning really a risk score to it. So say these are ones that the internet is saying is important, and say if it's an electric power, those information sharing venues that are in that particular ISAC would be interested in that. Out of that, as I mentioned, the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center really is a production house for communications and cyber-related product. These are just a couple of numbers of the things that it does, but 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, it is cranking out information, cyber-related product primarily, to our stakeholders. And our stakeholders are federal government, critical infrastructure, key resources, international partners, and there's different levels of sharing. Everyone familiar with the traffic light protocol? Okay, they set up kind of a system to allow people that share to put it in a traffic light protocol, and then depending upon the protocol, there are 4 levels that determines how broadly that information can be shared, so that the organization that gave the information has some control over it and confidence in how it will be used by other partner members. This is the information sharing kind of framework that DHS has established and that we help them with. Very broad sharing community. The one area that when I started supporting DHS in my current role 3 years ago that surprised me was the international. The scope and intensity of the contacts internationally with other CERTs around the world was a lot greater than I thought, and participation in some of the venues. It is not uncommon for DHS to be in contact with CERTs that you would think maybe we wouldn't be, like the China CERT or the Iranian CERT. There's levels of exchange and information exchange between those organizations. There's different levels of trust in the information that's exchanged, but there is information exchange. And the critical infrastructure sectors, the ISACs that we use to get information out to the community is very critical to that information sharing mission as far as the critical infrastructure sectors are concerned. Okay, one of the methods that the administration came up with was to share information was to create an automated indicator sharing so that you could do at machine speed exchange indicators of compromise. And we actually set this up. It's a cloud-based system in Amazon Web Services. You go through, anybody can apply to become a stakeholder in AIS. DHS will go through and vet. Not everyone who applies will get in, but the theory is, and this is probably the most broadly shared venue for where indicators are shared, once you become a stakeholder, you can go in and download the indicators that are in there, use those indicators then to protect yourself as part of your hygiene program. And thousands, hundreds of thousands of indicators are being pumped in there so that everyone can share in the data that's the indicators that are being put in there by other folks. It's also bilateral. You can upload indicators. If you've had an intrusion or an intrusion attempt, you can upload the indicators and say, hey, here's things that have happened to me that will go out to the broad community. Anyone that's a stakeholder in AIS then can have access to those indicators and use those to protect themselves. The thought is, since we haven't been able to get ahead of the threat or stop the threat, is let's start sharing indicators so that if one person gets popped, they can share those indicators, and hopefully that will cut off that attack venue down the road. Now, if you remember, I talked a little bit about the threat as like a dancing partner. We've had, when I was working really looking for advanced persistent threat in one of the large federal government, federal civil departments, Didn't have a real hard time finding them. Getting them out, ejecting them from our networks proved a little more difficult. There was one particular instance where the threat had gotten in. This organization had 10 regions. This particular agency that was one of the agencies in this department, and they had basically intruded into all 10 regions of this agency. Every Wednesday was Maintenance Wednesday. The threat actors would come in, do maintenance on the boxes and the infrastructure that they had, maybe pick up a couple new boxes, and then next Wednesday they would come back in. We went through and developed a plan to disrupt the infrastructure, which was basically changing their trusted internet connection, how that agency went out. That disrupted the infrastructure, didn't get rid of it, but the threat couldn't use it. They came back in about 2 weeks later using VPNs. So we worked with that agency to start to secure their VPNs using two-factor. They exempted their senior leadership from that requirement. And if you can imagine, the threat then went to using the senior leadership's VPN connections. Once we showed that to them, they implemented two-factor for all the VPN connections. The good news is threat activity stopped, but we also lost it, right? So I'm pretty sure they're back, but we just couldn't find them in that venue again. So that's the dancing with the partner, right? As you make a move, they make a move. As you up your game, they'll up their game. So what the automated indicator sharing platform is trying to do is allow everyone to get access to indicators, unclassified indicators, so you can upload and put it into your infrastructure to better protect yourself. Challenging thing about the threat, right? They react very quickly. We had an incident where the U.S. government, part of the U.S. government, one of the DHS organizations, announced a deportation of a Chinese national. There were 5 people involved in the press conference, or the press release on this. Within 32 minutes, all 5 of those individuals were spearphished. Also, we had a situation where the DHS Secretary Scheduler was always on what I call the frequent flyer list. They were constantly being sent malware. This one particular time, the actor probably didn't understand, well, didn't, because we were using a different level of Microsoft Office. They sent a more advanced copy. They couldn't use it. She emailed the actor back and said, hey, I can't open it. About 10-15 minutes later, he obliged and sent her a version that she could open. So the threat is very, they have great customer service, right? They don't always get it right, but they will endeavor to service you as a valued customer, say. And what this project is trying to do is trying to help make their lives a little more miserable. There are also 4 other indicator sharing programs that DHS runs that run all the way from specific things for critical infrastructure sectors up to where they will share classified indicators with companies in the U.S. As long as you meet certain security requirements in your infrastructure and how you do it. So it's not just unclassified, but it's a full range of indicators that the U.S. government has that they're trying to share with stakeholders to protect ourselves. A little bit on the international partnerships. The light blue are what is called in DHS, in the cyber world, the usual 5, which is pretty much just like the 5 Eyes. And this is the amount in scope, kind of in intensity of what we're doing around the world. This slide just talks a little bit about the end capabilities and what we're doing. And it really is a setup for the next 2 slides where we talk about some of the use cases that we're doing and some of the things. And this is what I'd like to think for you all is the so what. We use these capabilities to ingest, process, and produce information of cyber and communications alert and warning and get it out to stakeholders, whether they be international or the federal civil. All right, healthcare, and this is just a use case example that I want to kind of go over very quickly to show you what we're doing and how we do our business. So when you're reading a product off the NCIC or the AusCERT website or out of one of the indicator sharing programs, you kind of know what we're doing. First, there was some information that we got, third party, that said, hey, there could be indicator compromise against healthcare organizations. Our threat organization did some work. They actually went out to the threat services to see what the threat services had. Threat services also showed that and also provided them the malware. Our malware reverse engineers did their work. They put together a product. We went then to one of the information sharing analysis centers that cover the healthcare to validate, hey, does this look right to you? They came back and said, absolutely. Then within a couple hours, put out a product focused on the healthcare industry, both hospitals, doctors, insurance, on the threat to the healthcare. Next one, this is kind of more of an example because I want to show some of the other things that we're doing. Just like in healthcare, what we're doing is, as we get information and it trickles through the system, down across the bottom are other things that are kicked off, other services. I didn't cover any of these in this briefing, but DHS has a lot of services that they will provide to the federal government, other departments and agencies, and critical infrastructure key resource organizations, whether they be incident response teams, exercise programs, red-blue scanning programs that they'll do to do that at no cost to those organizations. But develop mitigation and also then update the things that we do for scanning, our vulnerability assessments that are bigger scale. So we pick up new information when we go out to do these proactive things to our stakeholders, that gets wrapped into that. And then indicator bulletins and indicator sharing programs are updated with that information so that the most current information is put out there. And only got a couple of minutes left, I think. So this one, my friend Steve and I worked together about 7 years ago. Steve Ginty, who for Risk IQ that just briefed. I'm going to cover the Grizzly Step, but slightly different. Everybody knows, if anybody followed the U.S. presidential election last year, there was a little bit of hijinks involved in that. Across the top are kind of what was out in the press. Across the bottom, some of that was in the press, but also some of the stuff was what DHS was doing. There's a lot going on in the background behind this, and there's stuff that I can't talk about. But there was a lot of involvement by DHS and other organizations figuring out what was going on with that event. And what I want to try to do with this is tie it back into the original setup when I was talking about the threat and how they've morphed, right? We now have other information about not only was the email system compromised, they took information and they were releasing it, but there could be other false information that's been injected into the system attempting to shed light or false light on things that were going on to confuse the investigation. So there's a lot going on this that nation-state actors are really going full spectrum, and they're taking it to the next level. So we need to be careful with the cybersecurity side of it. The other thing that I think we need to do is we do a great job of talking among ourselves, but I don't think we always do a great job of talking to our leadership and our management about some of the things that are going on so that they can be better prepared and understand some of the challenges that they are inheriting or that they've accepted by how we do business. DHS provided support to the presidential transition in this regard to make sure that the activity that happened at the DNC didn't transition over into the federal networks when the presidential transition started, regardless of which candidate won the election. So there was a lot of work done to make sure that if something happened outside in the political parties, that stuff didn't all of a sudden transition over into the White House networks, which could be pretty disastrous. Last slide. Kind of the summation for this. some of the stuff that we are doing as a company with the years of experience that we've had in cyber, and some may not know about Northrop. We do a lot of business, cybersecurity related business in the Department of Defense, U.S. Department of Defense, in the intelligence community there, and in the federal civil. So we've been doing this probably about as long as the cyber's been around. At least I've been with Northrop. And we've developed not only the framework, that the cyber fan that I showed you a little while ago, but also kind of how we do it and the capabilities that we're building for the next gen SOC, and how we move things forward to try to get in front of the threat and get a better so what. The next big thing I think in cyber is being predictive, right? And that's been the holy grail. And I think with the big data analytics and the information that we have, what we're trying to set up is use platforms and capabilities that will allow you then to become predictive in your organization, leverage some of the information sharing that's going on in the community to be predictive. So that's what we're trying to do as a company, and what we're doing working with our customer set to try to do that in building kind of unique and discrete capabilities. So with that, there's only a couple of minutes left. I just want to let some time for questions if there are. Sorry, this was such a quick overview.
Thank you for all of that. I'm sorry, I've got a cold, so a bit husky here. Do we have an ISAC for CNA? You didn't go into the CNA side of things, but is there an ISAC that you know of?
No. You're talking about certification or accreditation? Yeah. No. The National Institutes of Standards Technology have all the documentation for CNA. There's community of interests for CNA. And CNA is another one of those things that is necessary but not sufficient for that. So hopefully that. It would be embedded in each of the ISACs that are for critical infrastructure. They all do a little differently. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You've got about 6-7 minutes if you want to change rooms.